The distress signal came through every communication channel in the Galactic Council at exactly 800 hours standard time. Ambassador Thren of the Volari species stood before the council chambers with trembling hands as he played the message for the assembled delegates. His homeworld was dying. The Kresh Empire had arrived 3 weeks ago with 300 warships and surrounded Volari Prime like predators circling wounded prey. The Kresh were known throughout the galaxy as conquerors who showed no mercy to those they defeated. They enslaved entire populations and stripped planets of resources until nothing remained but empty husks floating in space. Now they wanted the Volari homeworld and everything on it. The message from Volari Prime showed burning cities and desperate civilians fleeing from orbital bombardments. Kresh ground forces had already landed in the northern continent and were pushing toward the capital city. The Volari military had fought bravely for 3 weeks, but their defenses were crumbling. They had perhaps 5 days before complete collapse. Ambassador Thren looked at each council member in turn and spoke with a voice that barely held back tears. He asked for help. He begged for intervention. He pleaded for someone to save his people from extinction. The council chamber erupted in discussion. The Trimani Federation expressed sympathy, but explained their fleet was 3 months away. The Norvith Collective offered humanitarian aid but admitted they had no military capability to challenge the Kresh. The Quillian Hive suggested diplomatic negotiations even though everyone knew the Kresh never negotiated. Species after species offered excuses wrapped in polite words. They all agreed the situation was terrible. They all agreed something should be done, but none of them could do anything in time to matter. Thren felt despair settling over him like a heavy blanket. His people would die and the galaxy would mourn them with empty words and useless sympathy. He gathered his belongings and prepared to return to his quarters when a junior council aide approached him nervously. The aide explained that one species had responded to the distress call. A species so new to galactic politics that most delegates barely knew their name. Humans from a planet called Earth had sent a message. Thren felt a flicker of hope despite himself. He asked what the humans said. The aide played the recording. A stern-faced woman in a dark blue uniform appeared on the screen. She identified herself as Admiral Kate Harrison of the Human Defense Fleet. Her message was brief and direct. She said humans had received the Volari distress call and were responding immediately. Her fleet would arrive at Volari Prime within 72 hours. She advised the Volari to maintain their defensive positions and protect civilians. She said help was coming and told them to hold on. The message ended. Thren stared at the blank screen in confusion. The human homeworld was even further away than the Trimani Federation. How could they possibly arrive in 3 days when other species needed months? More importantly, the aide showed him the human fleet composition. 12 ships. The humans were sending 12 warships to face 300 Kresh vessels. It was madness. It was suicide. It was pointless. But it was also the only help being offered. Meanwhile, on the human colony world of New Seattle, Admiral Harrison stood in the command center of the Orbital Defense Station, watching her fleet prepare for departure. She had received the Volari distress call 2 hours ago while drinking her morning coffee. Within minutes, she had pulled up every file the humans had on the Kresh Empire. Humanity had been monitoring the Kresh for 8 months since first hearing about their aggressive expansion. Human intelligence officers had infiltrated Kresh communication networks and stolen tactical data. Human analysts had studied every Kresh battle for the past decade. Humans knew exactly how the Kresh fought, and more importantly, they knew the Kresh weaknesses. Captain Ryan Mitchell commanded the flagship Thunderstrike and was busy overseeing final preparations. His ship was a modified dreadnought that looked ordinary from the outside, but carried weapon systems that would make most galactic species uncomfortable. Railguns that could accelerate projectiles to a fraction of light speed. Nuclear missiles with yields measured in megatons. Electronic warfare suites designed to jam and confuse enemy sensors. Point defense systems that could track and destroy hundreds of incoming threats simultaneously. The Thunderstrike was built for one purpose, and that purpose was winning battles. Lieutenant Sophie Grant sat at her tactical station running simulation after simulation. She was 28 years old and already considered a genius in military strategy. She had studied every major conflict in human history from ancient Rome to the Mars Rebellion. She understood that warfare was about psychology as much as firepower. The Kresh expected their enemies to be afraid. They expected hesitation and defensive postures. Sophie was planning something very different. She was planning to attack. Commander Jack Peters inspected his Marine battalions as they boarded troop transports. His soldiers wore powered armor that enhanced their strength and speed, while protecting them from hostile environments. They carried weapons that seemed primitive compared to galactic energy guns, but humans had learned long ago that simple, reliable technology often outperformed complex systems in actual combat. Peters had fought in urban warfare scenarios, on 3 different planets, and knew his troops were ready for anything the Kresh could throw at them. Dr. Helen Carter organized medical supplies in the fleet hospital ship. She was a civilian doctor who had volunteered for military service after seeing footage of Kresh atrocities on conquered worlds. She had studied alien biology for years and could treat dozens of different species. She packed trauma equipment and surgical supplies, knowing there would be casualties. She also packed humanitarian aid for Valerie civilians, because humans believed in helping the innocent even during wartime. The human fleet departed New Seattle exactly 90 minutes after receiving the distress call. No debates. No committees. No endless political discussions. Admiral Harrison had authority to respond to threats, and she used it. The 12 ships jumped into faster-than-light travel and disappeared from New Seattle space. The colony administrator sent a message to Earth Command explaining the situation. Earth Command reviewed Harrison's decision and approved it within an hour. Humans moved fast when lives were at stake. Back at the Galactic Council, news of the human response spread quickly. Some delegates were impressed by the speed of human decision-making. Others worried about the implications of such a small force challenging the Kresh. A few openly mocked the humans for their foolish bravery. Councillor Varix of the Trimani Federation gave a long speech about proper military doctrine and the importance of overwhelming force. He calculated that 12 human ships had approximately 0 chance of success against 300 Kresh warships. His mathematics were flawless, but his assumptions were completely wrong. At Valari Prime, the situation grew worse by the hour. Kresh Commander Vortak stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the planet burn beneath him. He had conquered 17 worlds in his career, and the Valari were proving easier than most. Their weapons barely scratched Kresh shields. Their tactics were predictable and defensive. Their morale was breaking. Vortak estimated another 4 days before the planetary government surrendered. Then the real fun would begin, as his troops rounded up the population for transport to slave markets. His sensor officer reported an incoming fleet signature detected at the edge of the system. Vortak barely paid attention. Probably another useless rescue attempt by some naive council species. His 300 ships could handle anything short of the entire council fleet, and everyone knew the council would never mobilize for a minor species like the Valari. He ordered 50 ships to intercept whatever fools were approaching. It would be good target practice for his newer crews. He turned back to watching the bombardment of Valari cities and dismissed the sensor report from his mind. He had no idea that everything was about to change. The humans had arrived and they brought violence with them. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Valari system, exactly 71 hours after departing New Seattle. Captain Mitchell stood on the bridge of the Thunderstrike studying the tactical display that showed 300 red dots representing Kresh warships surrounding the green dot that was Valari Prime. His crew waited in tense silence, expecting orders to fall back or call for reinforcements. Instead, Mitchell ordered all weapon systems to full power and set a direct course toward the Kresh blockade at maximum combat speed. His executive officer asked if they should attempt communication first. Mitchell replied that they had already communicated by showing up, and now it was time to teach the Kresh a lesson about picking fights with Deathworlders. Admiral Harrison sat in her command chair aboard her own vessel 3 kilometers behind the Thunderstrike and opened a communication channel to the entire Kresh fleet. Her message was broadcast on every frequency the Kresh used. She identified herself and informed the Kresh that they were in violation of Galactic Council protocols by attacking a peaceful species. She gave them 1 chance to withdraw immediately or face complete destruction. She waited exactly 30 seconds for a response. The Kresh response came in the form of mocking laughter and crude insults about human stupidity. Kresh Commander Vortak himself responded, saying he looked forward to adding human skulls to his trophy collection. Harrison closed the channel and gave a single order to her fleet. Weapons free. Engage at will. Show them what humans do to bullies. The Kresh had sent 50 ships to intercept the human fleet, expecting an easy victory against such inferior numbers. Those 50 ships were the first to learn that humans fought differently than any species the Kresh had ever encountered. At maximum weapons range, the human ships opened fire with railguns that launched solid metal projectiles at relativistic speeds. The Kresh had shields designed to disperse energy weapons, and they worked perfectly against lasers and plasma cannons. But kinetic projectiles traveling at a fraction of light speed simply punched through energy shields like they weren't there. The first Kresh ship died when a railgun slug tore through its hull from bow to stern and detonated its reactor. The explosion was visible from Valari Prime. The Kresh captains tried to adapt their shield frequencies but quickly realized shields were useless against solid matter moving that fast. They attempted evasive maneuvers, but the human AI targeting systems predicted their movements and adjusted fire accordingly. They launched their own missiles expecting to overwhelm human point defenses. The human ships deployed walls of defensive fire that destroyed incoming missiles while simultaneously launching their own nuclear-tipped warheads. Kresh sensors detected the nuclear signatures and panic spread through their communications. Nuclear weapons had been banned by Galactic Convention for centuries, as too barbaric for civilized warfare. Humans apparently had not received that message or simply did not care. Within 90 seconds of the first shot, 37 Kresh ships were nothing but expanding debris clouds. The remaining 13 ships of the intercept force scattered in panic, broadcasting desperate warnings to the main fleet. Kresh Commander Vortak watched from his flagship in shocked disbelief. Humans were supposed to be new to galactic civilization. They were supposed to be weak traders and explorers. Nobody had warned him they were this effective at violence. He ordered his entire fleet to converge on the human position and crush them through sheer numbers. It was a reasonable tactical decision based on 3 centuries of Kresh military doctrine. Unfortunately for Vortak, human military doctrine had been refined through 10,000 years of almost constant warfare on their brutal homeworld. Lieutenant Grant sat at her tactical station analyzing the Kresh fleet movements and smiled. The enemy was doing exactly what she had predicted. They were bunching together seeking strength in numbers. That made them predictable, and predictability in warfare was fatal. She transmitted coordinates to the other human ships, and they adjusted their formation accordingly. The human fleet didn't retreat or defend. They accelerated directly into the mass of Kresh vessels like a spear aimed at a target. Grant knew the Kresh expected their enemies to be afraid, but humans had fought predators far more dangerous than the Kresh. Humans had evolved on a world where everything tried to kill them, and they had become the apex predators of Earth through intelligence, tool use, and the willingness to cooperate in deadly efficiency. The human ships penetrated the Kresh formation and chaos erupted. Human vessels performed maneuvers that violated what the Kresh thought were the physical limits of ship handling. They used gravity assists from nearby moons to slingshot into unexpected vectors. They deployed clouds of metallic chaff that confused Kresh targeting sensors. They coordinated their attacks with split-second timing that suggested either telepathy or computer assistance far beyond galactic norms. Every human captain knew exactly where every other human ship would be at any given moment. The Kresh had numbers, but humans had something more valuable. They had centuries of tactical innovation, born from fighting each other before they ever reached space. Captain Mitchell brought the Thunderstrike into knife-fighting range with a Kresh Heavy cruiser and unleashed his full broadside. Railgun slugs shredded the enemy hull. Missiles slammed into already damaged sections. The Kresh ship tried to ram the Thunderstrike in desperation, but Mitchell had anticipated that and used maneuvering thrusters to slide sideways. The Kresh cruiser missed by meters, and Mitchell's point defense guns tore into its engines as it passed. The cruiser tumbled out of control and exploded when its damaged reactor went critical. Mitchell was already targeting his next victim before the fireball faded. On the surface of Valari Prime, the population watched their sky light up with explosions. The Kresh bombardment had completely stopped as every enemy ship diverted to deal with the human threat. Ambassador Thren stood on a balcony in the capital city staring upward in amazement. He could see the individual flashes of weapons fire even in daylight. He counted the explosions and tried to understand how 12 ships could be inflicting such damage on a fleet 25 times their size. A young Valari scientist next to him whispered that the humans weren't fighting like any known species. They were fighting like pack hunters from the ancient forests of Valari Prime before civilization. They were separating their prey and taking them down one by one, while moving too fast to be caught themselves. The battle raged for 3 hours, and the Kresh casualties mounted steadily. Vortak tried every tactic in his considerable experience. He attempted to flank the humans, but they detected the maneuver and repositioned before his ships arrived. He tried to concentrate fire on single human vessels, but their point defenses and damage control were too effective. He attempted to retreat to regroup, but the humans had deployed specialized jamming ships that prevented faster-than-light jumps within the system. The Kresh were trapped and being systematically destroyed by an enemy that refused to fight by established rules. Dr. Carter worked in the medical bay of the hospital ship treating wounded crew members from ships that had taken damage. Humans had casualties despite their technological advantages. Kresh plasma weapons could punch through armor if they hit at the right angle. Missile proximity explosions could shake ships hard enough to injure crew. But human casualty rates were remarkably low compared to the destruction they were inflicting. Carter treated a young ensign with a broken arm and told him he would be fine. The ensign asked how the battle was going. Carter pulled up the tactical display and showed him 140 Kresh ships destroyed, another 60 damaged and retreating. The human fleet had suffered minor damage to 3 vessels and lost 0 ships. The ensign smiled despite his pain and said the Kresh had picked the wrong species to mess with. Commander Peters waited in the Marine deployment bay watching the battle through external cameras. His job would come later when they dealt with Kresh ground forces. But right now he appreciated watching his fellow humans demonstrate why Earth had dominated its planet, despite being weaker than many predators, slower than most prey, and lacking natural weapons like claws or fangs. Humans won through intelligence and cooperation, and the willingness to use tools to overcome any obstacle. The Kresh were about to learn that lesson the hard way. Admiral Harrison monitored the battle from her command chair, noting each destroyed enemy vessel with professional satisfaction. She felt no joy in the killing, but she felt deep satisfaction in protecting innocents from predators. The Kresh had built their empire on fear and brutality. They expected their victims to be helpless and their enemies to be cautious. Harrison had spent her career studying military history, and she knew that bullies only understood one language. Overwhelming force applied without hesitation. The Kresh wanted violence. Humans were giving them more violence than they could handle. After 4 hours of continuous combat, Kresh Commander Vortak accepted the unthinkable. He was losing. His fleet had been reduced to 150 functional ships, and the humans showed no signs of slowing down. His crews were exhausted and demoralized. His ships were damaged and low on ammunition. The humans seemed to have endless supplies, and their morale was actually improving as Commander Peters stood in the deployment bay watching 2,000 Marines check their equipment and prepare for combat drop. The orbital battle was over, but the war continued on the surface where Kresh ground forces occupied 3 Volari cities and held thousands of civilians hostage. Traditional military doctrine called for careful planning and gradual assault. Human military doctrine called for hitting the enemy so hard and so fast, they never had time to react. Peters addressed his troops over the company network. He told them their mission was simple: drop into hostile territory, eliminate Kresh forces, rescue hostages, and do it all without killing a single innocent civilian. He reminded them that humans had standards even in war. They were not the Kresh, they were better. The Marines responded with a unified battle cry that echoed through the bay. The drop pods launched from orbit in waves of gleaming metal capsules that fell toward Volari Prime like artificial meteors. Each pod contained a single Marine in full-powered armor, along with enough ammunition and supplies for 48 hours of continuous combat. The pods used atmospheric friction to slow their descent, then fired retro rockets in the final seconds before impact. They slammed into streets and plazas and rooftops across all 3 occupied cities simultaneously. Kresh soldiers had never seen anything like it. They barely had time to look up before the pods split open and human Marines emerged ready for violence. Private Laura Bennett hit the ground in the capital city's main plaza and immediately took cover behind a fountain. Her armor sensors painted 20 Kresh soldiers in defensive positions around the plaza. Her rifle was a simple, chemically propelled weapon that fired solid bullets, but it was reliable and effective. She acquired her first target and squeezed the trigger. The Kresh soldier dropped before he even knew he was under attack. She shifted aim and fired again. Another Kresh down. The other Marines in her squad were spreading out and doing the same. Within 30 seconds, the plaza was secure and the squad was moving to their next objective. Sergeant Kyle Foster led his team through the narrow streets of the old quarter, where Kresh forces had established a command post in a historic building. His team carried breaching charges designed to blow through reinforced doors and walls. They approached the building from 3 directions simultaneously, while using their armor's active camouflage to remain nearly invisible. Foster planted charges on the main door and synchronized detonation with the other 2 teams. The explosions were precisely timed. 3 sections of wall disappeared in clouds of dust and flame. Foster's team stormed through the breach and found 6 Kresh officers staring in shock. The Kresh reached for weapons, but human reflexes enhanced by powered armor were faster. The engagement lasted 3 seconds. 6 Kresh officers neutralized without a single human casualty. Captain Lisa Morgan commanded the assault on the governor's palace, where Kresh General Zuralok held the Valari planetary governor and his staff hostage. Morgan knew Zuralok had threatened to execute the hostages if attacked. She also knew that empty threats only worked if your enemy believed them. She positioned snipers on surrounding rooftops and had her assault teams ready at every entrance. She opened a communication channel to Zuralok and spoke in clear Galactic Standard. She informed him that he had 60 seconds to release the hostages and surrender, or her teams would come in and take them. Zuralok responded with the expected threats. Morgan counted to 60 and gave the order. The assault teams breached simultaneously from 12 different points. They used shaped charges that directed blast force away from the interior to avoid harming hostages. They entered with weapons raised and armor sensors scanning for targets. Morgan's team found the hostages in the main conference room guarded by 8 Kresh soldiers. The Kresh tried to use hostages as shields, but human training covered that scenario. Snipers firing through windows took down the 4 Kresh with clear shots. Marines using non-lethal stun weapons disabled the other 4. The engagement lasted 7 seconds from breach to all clear. Not a single hostage received so much as a scratch. The Valari governor stared at the armored humans in amazement and managed to whisper a thank you. Morgan replied that humans didn't leave people to die if they could help it and moved on to secure the rest of the building. Lieutenant Ben Hayes cleared buildings in the financial district where Kresh soldiers had fortified positions and office towers. Urban warfare was humanity's specialty, refined through centuries of bitter experience in cities from Stalingrad to New Shanghai. Hayes understood that vertical combat required different tactics than fighting on flat ground. His team used grappling hooks and jump jets built into their armor to scale buildings from the outside and enter through upper floors. They caught Kresh defenders completely by surprise. The Kresh expected attacks from ground level, because that's how every species they'd ever fought approached urban combat. They had not considered that humans might come through the windows. Dr. Carter established a field hospital in a cleared area near the capital's main medical center. She treated wounded Valari civilians and surprisingly also treated captured Kresh soldiers. Some of the Marines questioned why she wasted resources on the enemy. Carter explained that humans had rules about warfare that included treating wounded, regardless of which side they fought for. The Geneva Conventions had been part of human military law for centuries and stated that medical personnel had a duty to help the injured. The Kresh prisoners stared at her in confusion. They had expected execution or torture. Instead, they received professional medical treatment and meals. One young Kresh soldier asked why humans were helping them. Carter replied that humans believed in something called mercy and maybe the Kresh should learn about it. Commander Peters personally led the assault on the communications hub where the last major Kresh force had barricaded themselves. Kresh General Zuralok commanded this position with 200 elite troops and enough firepower to level several city blocks. Zuralok broadcast a message threatening to destroy the hub and kill everyone inside, including Valari civilians who worked there. Peters studied the tactical situation and realized a frontal assault would result in massive casualties, both human and Valari. He needed a different approach. He contacted Lieutenant Grant, still in orbit, and asked if she could do something about the communications network. Grant smiled and began typing commands. Within 5 minutes, every screen in the Kresh command post displayed the same message. You have 5 minutes to surrender or we're coming in. Zuralok tried to shut down the screens, but they kept displaying the message. Then the lights began flickering. The environmental system cycled on and off. Door locks engaged and disengaged randomly. Grant had hacked into the building's automated systems and was demonstrating that humans controlled everything. Zravok realized he was trapped in a building that was actively working against him. His troops grew increasingly nervous as equipment malfunctioned around them. At 4 minutes, Zravok ordered his troops to hold position. At 4.5 minutes, his own soldiers mutinied and threw down their weapons. They would rather face human captivity than continue fighting an enemy that could turn their own base against them. By the 18-hour mark, all 3 cities were secure. Kresh forces had either surrendered or been eliminated. Hostages were freed and returned to their families. Valerie civilians emerged from shelters to find human Marines directing traffic and helping with rescue operations. The speed of the liberation shocked everyone, including the humans themselves. Peters had expected the ground campaign to take at least 3 days. The Kresh had proven so unprepared for human tactics that resistance collapsed far faster than anticipated. The Kresh were excellent at conquering peaceful species with orbital bombardment and overwhelming numbers, but they had no experience fighting an enemy that was actually better at violence than they were. Admiral Harrison received Peters's report and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The mission was a complete success. Valari Prime was liberated. The Kresh fleet was captured or destroyed. Human casualties were remarkably light, with only 37 wounded and 0 killed. Kresh casualties numbered in the thousands, but Harrison took no pleasure in that. She wished the Kresh had simply withdrawn when given the chance. She sent a message to Ambassador Thren informing him that his planet was free and his people were safe. Thren's response was emotional and filled with gratitude. Harrison replied that humans did not require thanks. They simply did what was necessary. The liberation of Valari Prime became galactic news within hours. Automated relay stations broadcast footage of the battle to every corner of known space. Species that had never heard of humanity suddenly became very interested in these newcomers. The Galactic Council held an emergency session to discuss the implications. Some delegates praised human intervention. Others expressed concern about human military capabilities that far exceeded what anyone had suspected. Councillor Varix of the Tremonti Federation demanded answers. He wanted to know why humans had hidden such power. He wanted to know what other surprises humans were concealing. He wanted to know if humanity represented a new threat to galactic peace. Ambassador Thren spoke passionately in humanity's defense. He pointed out that humans had responded when no one else would. They had. The Galactic Council chambers had never been so crowded. Representatives from 200 species filled every seat and standing space. News of the Valari liberation had spread across known space faster than any previous event in galactic history. Species that had suffered under Kresh aggression wanted to celebrate. Species that feared human power wanted answers. Species that remained neutral wanted to understand what had changed in the balance of galactic politics. Ambassador Thren stood at the podium waiting to introduce the human representative who would address this historic gathering. His hands still trembled when he remembered watching his homeworld burn and then watching 12 human ships turn the tide of battle in hours. Admiral Harrison entered the council chamber wearing her dress uniform rather than combat armor. She walked to the central platform where speakers addressed the assembled delegates and stood quietly while the chamber noise gradually died down. She looked around at hundreds of alien faces representing the full diversity of galactic civilization. Some looked at her with gratitude, some with fear, some with curiosity. Harrison had prepared a long speech about human history and philosophy, but looking at these faces, she decided to speak from the heart instead. She began by thanking the council for the opportunity to address them and acknowledged that humanity's actions had raised many questions. She promised to answer those questions honestly. Harrison explained that humans came from a planet called Earth, that galactic classifications designated as a Class 12 death world. She described Earth's environment where nearly everything was toxic, dangerous, or actively trying to kill humans. Gravity was higher than most habitable planets. Weather was violent and unpredictable. Diseases evolved constantly, requiring immune systems to adapt continuously. Predators had teeth and claws and venom. Even plants could be deadly. Humans survived this environment not by being the strongest or fastest, but by being smart, adaptable, and cooperative. They learned to use tools to overcome physical limitations. They learned to work together because individuals couldn't survive alone. They became the dominant species on Earth through 10,000 years of constant struggle. She continued by explaining that this harsh environment shaped human psychology and culture. Humans valued strength but also valued mercy. They respected warriors but also respected healers. They understood violence because they had practiced it for millennia, but they also understood that violence should serve a purpose beyond simple dominance. Human history was filled with wars that taught bitter lessons about the cost of conflict. Over centuries, humans had developed rules for warfare, designed to protect civilians and limit unnecessary suffering. These rules weren't perfect and weren't always followed, but they represented humanity's attempt to bring civilization even to the chaos of battle. Harrison addressed the fear she saw in some delegates. She acknowledged that humans possessed significant military capabilities. She explained that Earth's harsh environment and violent history had forced humans to become exceptional at warfare, simply to survive. But she emphasized that military power did not equal aggressive intent. Humans had joined galactic civilization seeking trade, knowledge, and friendship. They had no desire to conquer other species. They had seen the Volari distress call and responded because peaceful people were being slaughtered by bullies. That was not something humans could ignore. Harrison's voice grew firm as she stated that humans would always respond to such situations. Species that preyed on the weak should consider that carefully. Councillor Varix of the Tremonti Federation stood to question Harrison. He pointed out that humans had demonstrated capabilities far beyond what they had revealed when first joining the galactic community. He suggested this deception indicated untrustworthiness. Harrison met his gaze calmly and replied that humans had not deceived anyone. They had simply not advertised their full military strength because there had been no reason to do so. When asked during their application to join the Council about military forces, humans had provided accurate data about their defense fleets. No one had asked about weapons technology or tactical doctrine. Humans answered questions honestly, but they were not obligated to volunteer information that wasn't requested. Varix had no response to that logic. Another delegate asked what humans wanted in return for saving the Volari. Harrison looked genuinely confused by the question. She replied that humans wanted nothing except perhaps friendship with the Volari people. The delegate pressed the question, suggesting there must be some hidden price. Harrison explained patiently that human culture placed high value on helping others without expectation of reward. Ancient human philosophers had written extensively about moral duty and ethical behavior. Modern humans tried to live by principles that included protecting the innocent and opposing tyranny. The Volari needed help, so humans provided it. There was no transaction or hidden agenda. Some delegates seemed to accept this explanation. Others remained suspicious of such apparent altruism. While the Council debated humanity's nature, the Kresh Empire was making very different plans. In the Kresh home system, the High Command gathered in their war room staring at casualty reports from Volari Prime. They had lost 250 ships and thousands of ground troops to a force 1/25th their size. The humiliation was unbearable. Kresh military doctrine had never included the possibility of defeat. For 3 centuries, they had conquered every species they encountered. Their strategy was simple, overwhelming force applied without mercy. That strategy had just failed completely against humans, who fought with tactics the Kresh couldn't predict or counter. High Commander Draxus addressed the War Council with barely controlled rage. He declared that humanity represented an existential threat to Kresh dominance. If other species learned they could defeat the Kresh by copying human methods, the Empire would crumble. Therefore, humans must be destroyed completely as an example to anyone else who might consider resistance. Draxus ordered the mobilization of the entire Kresh fleet. 2,000 warships would converge on human space and annihilate Earth and every human colony. The Kresh would show the galaxy that challenging them only led to extinction. The War Council approved the plan unanimously. Kresh propaganda began broadcasting messages calling humans dangerous savages who threatened galactic peace. The Kresh declared total war on humanity. News of the Kresh declaration reached Admiral Harrison while she was still at the council chambers. She excused herself from the ongoing debates and contacted Earth Command. The conversation was brief. Earth's military leadership had been monitoring Kresh communications and had anticipated this response. They were already implementing contingency plans. Harrison was ordered to return to human space immediately. Her relief fleet was already in transit. Harrison thanked them and closed the channel. She returned to the council chamber and announced that humans appreciated the council's hospitality, but she had military duties requiring her immediate departure. She departed without ceremony, leaving the delegates to continue debating among themselves. Ambassador Thren followed Harrison to her shuttle bay. He caught up with her as she was preparing to depart and spoke urgently. He explained that the Volari wanted to help humanity face the Kresh retaliation. His government was prepared to offer their industrial capacity and agricultural output to support human war efforts. Harrison was touched but pointed out that the Volari were still recovering from occupation. Thren replied that his people recovered quickly when they had something to fight for. Humans had saved them. Now Volari would stand with humans. Harrison accepted the offer and promised that humanity would remember this gesture. Other species began making similar overtures. The Norvath Collective secretly contacted human representatives offering technological exchanges. The Quillian Hive proposed intelligence-sharing agreements. A dozen minor species that had suffered Kresh aggression sent messages of support. Even some council members who had publicly criticized human methods sent private communications expressing hope that humans would succeed. The galaxy was dividing into those who supported the Kresh Empire through fear or profit, and those who hoped humanity might finally end the Kresh threat. A coalition was forming, though few were brave enough to declare it openly yet. Harrison returned to New Seattle to find the human fleet had quadrupled in size. Earth and the colonies had activated reserve forces and accelerated ship construction. The orbital shipyards worked continuously building new vessels using designs refined from the Volari engagement. Human engineers analyzed the captured Kresh ships and identified additional weaknesses to exploit. Human intelligence officers interrogated Kresh prisoners and mapped the Empire's industrial infrastructure. Humans were preparing for total war with the efficiency and thoroughness that had allowed them to dominate their death world. Lieutenant Grant was promoted to commander and given charge of strategic planning. She spent days analyzing the Kresh threat. 2,000 ships was a massive force that could overwhelm human defenses through sheer numbers, even with superior human technology. A defensive strategy would eventually fail. Grant studied historical examples from human warfare looking for solutions. She found inspiration in ancient Earth conflicts where smaller forces defeated larger ones. The human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel simultaneously at 3 different Kresh industrial systems. The timing was perfect down to the microsecond. Admiral Harrison coordinated the assault from her flagship, while Captain Mitchell led the strike force at the primary target. The Kresh defenders were completely unprepared. Their main fleet had departed weeks earlier, heading toward Earth expecting to find humans cowering behind fortifications. Instead, the humans had bypassed the Kresh fleet entirely and struck at the industrial heart of the Empire. The first Kresh knew of the attack was when human railgun fire started tearing through their orbital facilities. Commander Grant's intelligence had been accurate. The Kresh had concentrated their military power in the offensive fleet, leaving their home systems defended by outdated ships and inexperienced crews. The orbital shipyards around Kresh Prime were massive structures capable of producing hundreds of warships annually. They were also completely vulnerable to attack. Mitchell's battle group swept through the system, destroying defensive positions with clinical efficiency. Human Marines boarded several facilities and secured them intact as ordered. Peters led one such boarding action, personally fighting through corridors filled with panicked Kresh workers who surrendered immediately when they realized humans weren't executing prisoners. The second strike, force commanded by Captain Angela Brooks, hit the Kresh manufacturing world of Drexia, where the Empire produced ammunition, armor, and ship components. Brooks had spent 15 years in the Earth Defense Force and knew exactly how to cripple industrial capacity. Her ships targeted power generation facilities, supply depots, and transportation hubs. Within 6 hours, Drexia's industrial output dropped to 15% of normal. The Kresh garrison attempted a counterattack, but Brooks had positioned her ships to create overlapping fields of fire. The Kresh vessels flew directly into a killing zone and lasted less than 10 minutes. The third strike force under Captain Victor Hayes attacked the Kresh research station at Kelvor, where the Empire developed new weapons and technologies. Hayes had orders to capture the station if possible, because human intelligence wanted access to Kresh research data. His Marines used breaching pods that attached directly to the station hull and cut through. They encountered stiff resistance from Kresh security forces who fought desperately to protect classified information. The battle raged through the station for 4 hours before Hayes's troops secured the main computer core. Lieutenant Grant would later describe the captured data as invaluable for understanding Kresh capabilities and weaknesses. Back at Kresh High Command, the news of the attacks created chaos. High Commander Draxus stared at tactical displays showing 3 critical systems under simultaneous assault. He immediately ordered the main fleet to reverse course and return to defend Kresh space. But the fleet was 3 weeks away at maximum speed. The humans had planned this perfectly. By the time Kresh reinforcements arrived, the damage would be done. Draxus faced an impossible choice: continue toward Earth and risk losing everything at home, or turn back and abandon the offensive. He made the worst possible decision. He split his forces, sending half back to Kresh space while continuing toward Earth with the remainder. It was exactly what human strategists had predicted. Admiral Harrison received reports of the Kresh Fleet Division and allowed herself a brief smile. The enemy had made a critical tactical error. A divided force was weaker than a concentrated one. Human ships could now defeat each half separately, rather than facing the full fleet at once. She transmitted new orders to her fleet: complete the destruction of Kresh industrial capacity, and then regroup at Rally Point Gamma. The human vessels had jump coordinates for a location between Earth and the approaching Kresh fleet. They would intercept the enemy before the Kresh reached human worlds. Harrison had no intention of allowing Kresh warships anywhere near Earth. At New Seattle, the defense fleet awaited the coming battle. Colony Administrator Chen had evacuated non-essential personnel and activated every defensive platform and orbital weapon. The colony militia drilled for ground combat in case Kresh troops somehow made it to the surface. But Chen also watched intelligence feeds showing the human offensive into Kresh space. She understood Harrison's strategy. The best way to defend New Seattle was to ensure the Kresh never reached it. Chen had faith in her fellow humans. They had survived Earth's deadly environment. They would survive this war. The human assault forces completed their objectives within 48 hours. Kresh Prime's orbital shipyards were rubble. Drexia's factories burned. Kelvor Station was captured intact with all its research data. Human casualties were moderate, with 37 ships damaged and 6 destroyed. Thousands of crew members died in those ships, but they died accomplishing their mission. Dr. Carter worked continuously treating wounded who were transferred to hospital ships. She saved hundreds of lives through skill and determination. But she also held the hands of those she couldn't save, and promised them their sacrifice mattered. It was the hardest part of her job. But she never shirked it. The human fleet regrouped and jumped to intercept the Kresh force. Approaching Earth, 1,000 Kresh warships met 300 human vessels at a location humans designated the Anvil Point. The Kresh commander was Admiral Court, who had personally overseen the conquest of 7 species. He saw the human fleet and felt confident despite his numerical advantage being smaller than expected. 1,000 ships against 300 were still favorable odds. He ordered his fleet into a standard Kresh attack formation and advanced. It was the last mistake he would make. The human fleet didn't form defensive lines or attempt to match the Kresh formation. Instead, they scattered into small battle groups that used superior speed and maneuverability to strike from unexpected angles. Court tried to adjust, but his formation was designed for straightforward confrontation, not this fluid 3-dimensional chess game humans were playing. Human ships would concentrate fire on isolated Kresh vessels, then disperse before reinforcements arrived. They used debris from destroyed ships as cover and concealment. They launched missiles on ballistic trajectories that approached from directions the Kresh weren't watching. Every human captain had studied the Volari engagement and refined their tactics. The result was devastation. Lieutenant Grant coordinated the battle from her tactical station aboard Harrison's flagship. She tracked every human and Kresh ship simultaneously and fed targeting data to all battle groups. Her tactical AI predicted Kresh movements seconds before they happened, allowing human ships to position themselves perfectly. Grant had studied military history obsessively since childhood. She understood that technology and firepower mattered, but tactics and strategy won wars. She was proving that principle against an enemy that had overwhelming numbers but predictable doctrine. Commander Peters led a boarding action against a Kresh command ship. His mission was to capture Admiral Court alive if possible. Human intelligence wanted information about Kresh strategic planning, and Court would have valuable knowledge. Peters and his Marines cut through the Kresh hull and fought through corridors filled with enemy troops. Powered armor made humans nearly invincible in close quarters. Kresh weapons barely scratched the advanced alloys. Human weapons went through Kresh armor like paper. Peters reached the bridge and found Cord attempting to destroy his command database. Peters shot the console with a stun weapon and took Cord into custody. Mission accomplished. The battle raged for 18 hours. When it ended, 600 Kresh ships were destroyed and 300 had surrendered. The remaining 100 had escaped into faster-than-light travel and fled. Human losses were 90 ships destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The victory was costly but decisive. The Kresh offensive was shattered, but the war wasn't over. The other half of the Kresh main fleet was still returning to defend their home systems. Admiral Harrison gave her exhausted crews 12 hours to rest and repair, then ordered them to pursue. Humans would finish what they started. Meanwhile, at New Seattle, unexpected reinforcements arrived. 20 different species had sent fleets to support humanity. Some sent only a few ships, others sent dozens. The Volari contributed their entire planetary defense force. The Norvath sent their most advanced vessels enhanced with their best technology. Even some species that had been neutral in the conflict decided they preferred human victory over Kresh survival. Colony Administrator Chen welcomed the Allied fleets and integrated them into New Seattle's defenses. The galaxy was choosing sides and humans were no longer alone. The final battle occurred at Kresh Prime, where the remaining enemy fleet made their last stand. 1,000 Kresh ships defended their homeworld against 400 human vessels, plus 200 Allied ships from various species. High Commander Draxus commanded the defense personally. He had lost everything. His industrial base was destroyed. His armies were scattered. His empire was collapsing, but he would make the humans pay in blood for their victory. He broadcast a message to all Kresh forces. Fight to the death. Take as many humans with you as possible. Show the galaxy that Kresh do not surrender. His troops responded with determined courage. They would lose, but they would lose fighting. Captain Mitchell led the assault on Kresh Prime Zur.